Hello to you, I'm Bryan Moon, founder of MIA Hunters and Missions Director. I've got a lot to tell you today, and I thank you for tuning in to us. I'm sorry I can't be with you, this is the next best thing. But I think we're going to intrigue you for the next 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to show you some live video. What would you say if a man comes up to you and says, any chance you could find my father? And I say, well, where is he? And he said, well, he was flying an Airacobra fighter plane in 1943 over the jungles of Papua New Guinea. He was shot down. And he's been missing all these years. Any chance you could find him? So I say, well, can you tell me a little more? I mean, where was he shot down? Well, I'm not quite sure. It's somewhere in northern New Guinea. And, I'm not quite sure after that. So I said, you realize that Papua New Guinea, which is north of Australia and just short of the tropics, is a bed of disease, for one. It's tropical, so it's 90 degrees of heat or more most of the time, if it isn't pouring with rain. The crocodiles in the rivers are certainly not friendly. You've got locusts, and you've got ants, and you've got spiders, and you've got all kinds of crawlies that are trying to get at you. And on top of that, you've got one of the biggest jungles in the world, much of which is impenetrable, parts of which are still controlled by headhunters. And you want me to go out there and find your father, who's been missing for now 65 years? Doesn't that sound like an impossible mission? Well, as a matter of fact, at that time it did sound like an impossible mission to me. But 20 years later, we look back and we've made impossible missions possible. How we did that, you're going to find out. I think it might be interesting to walk you through some of the missions that we've taken before we started to tackle the jungles of Papua New Guinea. Let me give you an example, because there are no two missions that are the same. So you can't say this mission is representative of everything we've done. And let me just say, in 20 years, we've made 24 missions all over the world. We have found in that time over 200 missing MIAs, lost for 65 years. The people that come with me are quite exceptional. When we brief them, we tell them, before you leave home, you better put your house in order, because you're going to be taking some risk. You're going to be stepping into some considerable risk at some times. You're going to be paying for your own way, and when you get back, you won't get any thanks, and you won't get any recognition. So it's not a very attractive proposition to start with. And I've been amazed that I can find people that will step up to the plate because they recognize the need to bring back our MIAs. And they're saying to themselves, if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. And we don't pull any punches. We don't pretend it's an easy trip, which it isn't. It's expensive. And these people that come with me are quite remarkable. I haven't drawn a salary in 20 years. None of the people who work with me are paid, so we don't do this for money. We have no funding from governments or military or any rich uncles. And so the bottom line is we have to make our own way and pay our own way. And that's how these missions are funded. It's quite remarkable when you think about that people will step up to the plate and do that. So anyway, let me tell you first of all about some of the missions we've been on, how they work. There's no real pattern to it, so I'll just pick one at random. For instance, it wasn't so long ago that my son picked up an picked up a message on the internet. And the internet message was from a lady, and she was saying that surely there's someone out there that can help me find a relative of hers who disappeared in a B-24 bomber in 1943. And again, that was over the north coast of Papua New Guinea. And there must be someone out there who's been trying for months and months to get some help. There's no one helping me. There must be someone out there. And we came across this email. And when you get an email, of course, you can't tell where it comes from. I mean, it could come from New Zealand, it could come from Russia, South America, anywhere in the world. And so when I replied to it, I said, look, I'm an MIA hunter. I'm interested in your problem. I'd like you to send me all the information you have, but I need you to phone me or fax me or email me, and I gave her all these addresses, and I said to her, I live in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, USA. Please contact me. Would you believe the next day the phone rings, and a lady says, you're not going to believe this. I live in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, USA. Now what are the chances of that? Millions to one. And you're going to hear this kind of mini miracle that's happening all the time. I think somebody must be watching over us, because most remarkable things are happening in the course of finding our MIAs. So anyway, she gave me all the information I needed in pretty short order. And this B-24 bomber had flown from the north of Papua New Guinea to Rabaul on a bombing mission one night. Came back that night, and the last recorded message from the radio operator said, where have all the lights gone? And he was crossing the coast of Papua New Guinea, couldn't see any lights where they were supposed to be, and apparently crossed the coast in the wrong place, and seconds later impacted a mountaintop. 11 men dead in an instant, including this lady's relative. The airplane hasn't been seen since for over 60 years, and we had one lead on its location. Two other missions who tried to find it had not succeeded. One, in fact, was in a helicopter, and the helicopter crashed and injured some of the crew. But we picked up a lead, and 8 months later, 5,000 feet up on the top of the mountain, we found this B-24 bomber, shattered in pieces, spread over perhaps a quarter of a mile. And so we inspected the wreckage, and sure enough, it was very easily identifiable as a B-24 bomber. So we came back from that, and what is our custom is, so we're a search organization. We do not attempt to retrieve the bodies. In fact, we treat the crash sites as holy ground. This is a burial site. And so our practice is to on-site photograph it, videotape it, identify whether it's American or Japanese or Australian, and then try and identify after that exactly what type of airplane it is, and then if we can specifically which airplane it is from tags on the side of the airplane, or tail numbers or fuselage numbers or whatever. And if we get to that point, then with a computer we can find the names of all the crew that are on that plane, were on that plane. But our practice is, having done all that and mapped the sites, GPS locations of every site, of course, when we get back to the United States, I send this recording, these photographs and the DVDs and all the information we have, to the U.S. Army in Hawaii. And they're the experts on MIA retrieval. And they will take the information we give them, they will follow up, they will send a crew to, in this case, Papua New Guinea, to the site that we have identified. And sure enough, sometime later, all 11 men from this airplane were brought back to the USA, and they were buried in a communal grave in Arlington. And so that's the way it works. When the Army bring back the remains of these missing men, those remains are taken to their headquarters in Hawaii, and they go through forensic tests with all the bones and whatever you've found. And that's quite an extensive operation. And it's not until they're absolutely satisfied which bones are which person that they finally communicate with the relatives and tell them that their son or their father or uncle or whatever the relationship is has been found and is coming home. On the other hand, they rarely say that MIA hunters found them, but that's a small point. So anyway, that's the way the whole system seems to work. And so we, as a hunter group, all my people are told that you must not remove anything from the sites. We are not there to pillage. We are not there to bring back souvenirs. You don't do that in a cemetery, which is what we regard their crash sites as. And so each person that comes with me has to sign a release that says they will take nothing, absolutely nothing from the site. And we treat the sites with respect in that way. There are a lot of other hunter groups that go there for different reasons, in part perhaps to bring back parts to sell them, and that's not our bag. That's not what we do. So there is one example anyway of how we found one bomber and 11 men that came home. But as I say, every situation changes, and the contacts, the way we get the information, it also changes. I'll give you another example. I had a telephone call one day from a police officer in Austin, Texas, and he phoned me up to say, my uncle was shot down over some islands south of Japan in World War II, towards the end of World War II. He was flying an F-4U Corsair fighter plane from an aircraft carrier, and he was shot down. He was seen to parachute out of his plane. He was seen to land in his dinghy in the water, but he hasn't been seen since. Is there any chance you could find him? And I told him immediately that if he came down into the water and he wasn't found within 24 hours of bailing out of his airplane, the chances of finding him are extremely remote. But that's not to say we won't have a go at it, which we will. So I've asked him for all the information. He gave me all the information, and it's really quite an interesting problem. So we then start a research program, parts of which come from relatives, parts of which come from archival material. The archival material sometimes leads you to a wingman that might have been flying alongside of him that could offer some more information. And then you go to the archival information, printed archival information, to see what you can find. Sometimes you find a lot, sometimes you find little. In this particular case, we found quite a lot. And we went on with our research, extensive research, and here was the first impossible situation. Would you believe that the person we found, or the person we caught up with, was the Japanese fighter pilot that had shot him down 60 years ago. And his name was Hayao Fujimoto. Now, Fujimoto, it turned out, was a Japanese fighter ace, shot down over 20 Allied planes, and survived some of the most historic battles of the Pacific. And so I contacted Hayao Fujimoto, and I said to him, by the way, he's 89 years old at the time, and I said to him, look, you had a conflict in the air over an island called Amami Oshima, which is halfway between the south of Japan and Okinawa. And I said, if you remember, you shot down an American fighter plane there, an F-4U Corsair, and I have the nephew of the pilot, and that nephew would very much like to meet you. Would you grace us with a meeting if I brought that young man to Tokyo to meet you? And fortuitously, he said yes, he would. So then I phoned the young man who's making the inquiry, the police officer, and I said, look, I got a little surprise for you. We found this fighter pilot that shot down your uncle, and I've asked him if he would meet us, and he said he would, so I'm inviting you to come with me to Tokyo to meet Hayao Fujimoto, who shot down your uncle 60 years ago. So he was nonplussed, and he didn't know what to say at first. And I said, look, I want you to know, though, this is a peace mission. I'm not taking you there to punch him on the nose or anything like that. So he said, okay, this I've got to do. So my older son, Christopher, and Christopher's been with me on most of my missions. We flew him out to Tokyo, where he met Hayao Fujimoto. We videotaped the first meeting. It was really quite an emotional meeting. And in a very short time, they became quite good friends. And during the time we were together, Fujimoto spelled out to this police officer exactly how the conflict in the air had begun and how he had shot down his uncle. And in fact, he told the nephew, he said, I don't know whether you know this, but I was flying top cover. And he said, I saw your uncle fly in and shoot down one of my other crewmen. And he said, at that point, I dived down on his tail and shot him down. And he said, I saw him jump out of his plane, parachuted. And he was coming down his parachute, he was kicking, he was all alive. And I circled him, and I followed him down for about 2,000 feet to about 8,000 feet. And he said, I did not shoot at him because I've been shot down twice by Americans, and they didn't shoot at me, so I didn't shoot at him. And I saw him descending into the water, but I could not stay to see where he landed because the conflict was going on above me, and so I returned to the conflict. But that's how it happened. And the interesting thing about this was that police officers did not know that his uncle had shot down a Japanese plane because this was his first fighter mission. So that was an interesting interlude. Anyway, we talked about this for a long time, and I said to him, look, why don't you come with to Hayao Fujimoto? Would you come with us to Amami Oshima, where this conflict took place, for one last try to see if we can possibly find this airman? I know the chances are not good. He said, yes, I will. So then we caught a flight, flew to Amami Oshima, about an hour and a half flight of the south of Japan, and landed there and checked into a hotel there for a while. And then we started on the investigation, and we actually chartered a large steel boat, and we were going out to the site where his uncle had parachuted into the water, and Fujimoto and he were side by side, and it was a very rough day. We walked and we drove out in the boat to this site, and launched two big white crosses, which we had counterbalanced so that they would stay upright. And these two white, one of them, the Japanese man launched one, and the American launched the other. These two crosses went off into the water, and somehow or other, these two American and the Japanese man were standing side by side. The two crosses came together off the port side of the boat. It was quite a remote, emotional thing. In the evening, we met with the Japanese press, and it became a story throughout the whole of Japan. And we were asked, look, what is the message we need to give to the islanders? And I said, it's a very simple one. The message is, if anyone on this island knows of the body of an American being washed ashore and knows possibly where that body is buried, that's what we need to know, and that's all we need to know. So the next day, the press broke it in grand style, TV, radio, newspapers, and everything. And we settled down, and I told Christopher and this young man, today is the day it's all going to happen, or we're out of luck, because we've got no more leads. If we don't get a call today, then this mission is over. And we waited. In the afternoon, the phone rang, and my Japanese interpreter, who's a good friend of mine, he took the call, and the lady who was calling said her name was Mrs. Shimeo, and that she was the widow of the Japanese commanding officer of those islands during World War II. And she was greatly impressed by what we were doing to take back our MIAs to America. And did we know that there was another American shot down about the same time over Amami Oshima? We said, no, we did not. She said, well, why don't you come and see me, and I'll tell you about him. So we go off to see her rather. And as the story goes, the second American was attacking shipping off the coast, and he was shot down, and he was killed in the crash of his airplane on an adjacent island to the one we were on, part of the same island group. And her husband, who was a very humanitarian man, he survived the war but had since died, and he became a famous writer. And her husband apparently sent his soldiers to bring the body of the American to him. And when they brought the body of the American to him, he directed them to have this young man respectably buried in the Japanese cemetery, which was on the side of the hill, a short distance away, Japanese civilian cemetery. And he directed his soldiers to bury him properly and to put a cross over his grave, and they did that. But the local peoples, Japanese civilians, did not like an American being buried in their cemetery. And so they kept taking up the cross and throwing it out on the road. And he directed his men to keep putting the cross back. So for the final 4 or 5 months of the war, this cross was doing the yo-yo on the grave and off the grave and so on. When the end of the war came, of course, all the military left, the grave was forgotten, and it's been forgotten for over 60 years until we showed up, and until by sheer chance, Mrs. Shimeo called us. So this lovely lady that we went to see, we said to her, look, can you tell us where this grave is? And she said, yes, you've got to go the length of the island, catch a boat to another island, and she gave us directions. So we did that, we landed on the other island, and sure enough, over in the side of the hill, there was a Japanese civilian cemetery. And but we needed to find someone that could help us, and this was practically a deserted village, but we found 2 people there. And one was a lovely elderly Japanese lady who was working in the garden. And our Japanese interpreter said to her, were you here in World War II? And she said, oh yes. So he said, do you know anything about an American being buried in a cemetery here? She said, oh yes, he's over there in the side of the hill in our cemetery. Oh, really? Do you know where he was buried then? She said, oh yes. So we said, well, do you suppose you could guide us there and show us exactly the spot? She says, certainly. So she takes us to the cemetery. We go over there, and without any question of doubt, she plods her way through various parts of the cemetery, and she points and she said, he's buried here. And we said, are you sure of that? Oh, yes. And immediately she goes off and picks some plumeria flowers, and she plants them on the grave. She kneels down and prays at this gravesite. We didn't ask her to do that, but she did. And it was a very moving moment for us, especially to know that we had found where this American who'd been missing all these years had been buried, and there was a good chance now that he'd be coming home. So we went back to see Mrs. Shemeo again, and we said to her, we thanked her first of all for telling us where this gravesite was and helping us to find and told her that we'd been there. And I said to her, look, I've got to ask you one question. I know this is a far-out question, and maybe a little ridiculous, but I've got to ask you, do you happen to know the name of that American that you met perhaps only once and he was dead at the time, and your husband had him buried? Do you happen to know his name? And not really expecting anything from that. And she said, yes. And I get paper and pencil. She said, his name was Norman Wheatridge. Very unusual name. I mean, it wasn't Fred Smith or Tom Jones or something. Norman Wheatridge, she said. I write it down. I think, well, what are the chances that this Japanese lady, 60 years after the war, can remember the name of an American pilot she met once when he was deceased, and all these years later can play back to me an accurate name? There's absolutely no way this could be right. And so we came back to the United States and we started on our research again there. And sure enough, we looked up the military records for military action over the islands of Amami Oshima in the beginning of April 1945, last year of the war. And sure enough, on this particular day, one American pilot had been shot down, and his name was Lieutenant Norman Wheatridge. He was the last American to be found on Japanese soil from World War II. Now, if that doesn't grab you, I don't know what does, because these stories go on like this. They're quite remarkable things are happening. I think somebody must be watching over us, and it's sometimes a little hard to keep up with, but that's the way things happen. The Papua New Guinea story is really a developing story because in World War II, Papua New Guinea was really the turning point of World War II in the Pacific War. The Japanese, as you know, after Pearl Harbor, swept across the Pacific. And the closest they got to Australia and New Zealand was the north coast of Papua New Guinea. It was their intention to capture the whole of Papua New Guinea and from there attack Australia. And in fact, they actually did some bombing raids on the north coast of Australia from the northern part of Papua New Guinea. But anyway, their intention was to sweep across Papua New Guinea, capture the capital city of Port Moresby, which is on the south and had a good harbour, and from there they could launch their attacks on Australia. Well, the Japanese therefore controlled the north coast of Papua New Guinea, and the Americans and the Australians controlled all the southern half, and in between there's a very high range of mountains, and everything is jungle from there on. It's a very dense, difficult, hard country. So the war in Papua New Guinea really went on for about 2.5 years until the Americans and the Australians pushed the Japanese off the northern part of the island, and it started the island hopping war all the way back to Japan. But this was the turning point. And because this was the turning point, and because the conflicts, not only on the ground but in the air, had been going on for about 2.5 years, there were enormous losses on both sides. In fact, many of the Japanese fighter aces became aces as a result of their operations in the first half of the war in the Japanese Zero fighter, which was then far superior to anything else. They became aces on that island. But so the island of Papua New Guinea became more and more fascinating as we got to know it better. And oddly enough, the first time we went there, It started because I had a telephone call from a newsman in Minneapolis. We're based in Minnesota, MA Hunters. And I had a call from a newsman who said, I've had a call from a man in northern Minneapolis who claims he knows a man in Papua New Guinea, who claims he knows some natives, who claim they know where there's a crashed American fighter plane and they found the body of the pilot. So he said, I'm not going to go out there to find that, but if you're dumb enough to have a go at it, I thought I'd give you the information. So I said, that's fine. Give me the name of the man in northern Minneapolis, I'll phone him and I'll track it all the way back, which I did. And eventually I contacted him. His contact in New Guinea was a Papuan called Michael Roy, who's educated, perfect English-speaking young man. And he apparently had been in touch with some of the natives in the jungle who made these claims. So I was in touch with him and I said, look, I'm interested in coming over there and seeing this crash site. But he said, well, in order to do that, you're going to have to go and live in the jungle with these natives. They never had white men there before, but I'm sure they'd love to accommodate you. And he said, but I got to tell you, they want $15,000 for the remains of the pilot. And I said, that's ridiculous. And I got really annoyed about it because I said, do you realize that this young man was fighting for your country when he was killed? And now you're trying to sell his body back to America? That is gross. How can you do that? So I said, I'm not going to do that. But I said, on the other hand, I know that your people probably did some digging, so maybe there's some compensation for digging, but I'm not going to talk to you in terms of that kind of money. So in order to leave the door open, that's what we did. And I phoned Christopher and I said, okay, Chris, I got some great news for you. We're going out to the jungle, we're going to live with a family in Papua New Guinea. He said, well, aren't there headhunters there? I said, well, yeah, I suppose there are. He said, well, are there any in the village? I said, I really don't know. He said, don't you think we ought to find out farther before we go? So anyway, I said, oh, it's no big deal, we're going next week. So we left and we got to Papua New Guinea and we met Michael Roy. And sure enough, he had a broken down old pickup truck which we had to push start. And this was our Hertz U-Drive car. And we drove something like 60 miles out into the jungle in this rickety old truck, arriving at this village in the jungle of maybe a dozen thatch roof huts. And all the villagers turned out to greet us because this was something special to them to have white men come and stay with them. It was really unknown. And of course it was special to us because we had not had the experience before either. And weren't quite sure what we were in for. So anyway, they emptied out one of their huts and they gave us one of their huts. The family moved somewhere else, not quite sure. They built us a private little toilet. They built us a private washroom, and they really went out of town to make us welcome. And then I think they tried to make sure that we were fed American style, because when we got up for breakfast the next morning, what we had was cold baked bean sandwiches for breakfast. So they were doing the best they could, but that's all right. And so in these cases, you take what comes and you make the best of it, you see. So anyway, eventually they took us on, I think they're trying to test us because they took us on a crocodile hunt, which was very scary. And then at nighttime, they took us on a hunt for a wild pig, which was even worse. But we survived those two, and then after that, they said, okay, now we'll take you and show you the crash site, which they did. And sure enough, here was a P-47 Thunderbolt fighter in pieces, 4 blades of the propeller, ammunition rotting, guns, virtually the whole airplane there in pieces. And in the ground there was a big 10-foot wide, 8-foot deep, or 10-foot deep hole from which they had excavated this airplane. And the amazing thing was that when they started to excavate, they started to find bones. And they put the bones aside and they washed the bones and carried them in a cloth back to their village. And the man that did this was a man called Moses. He hung the remains over his bed that night. And he claims that he was just going to sleep when he had an apparition of a young man in one-piece suit and goggles and helmet. And the young man said to him, I want you to go back and find my necklace. And then the image disappeared. And the next morning, Moses took another group back and they started to dig again. The first thing he found was the dog tag on the chain, the necklace, first thing. So they found the rest of the bones and teeth, and they found a wallet. They didn't know this, there were 2 people in that site, but I'll tell you about that in a moment. And they found all the remains and brought them back to his house that night again, hung them over his bed, and this apparition of the young man he claims appeared to him again and said, "Thank you. Thank you for taking me out of that cold, damp place. Now you are my friend." And the reason he explained it as a cold, damp place is because the airplane had crashed into a swamp, and for 60 years had been covered over by water, except in those 60 years the ground had dried out and was no longer a swamp. And that's how they found and were able to retrieve all the remains. What they didn't know, and we had researched before this young man who was 22 years old from Dearborn, Michigan, Harold Wirtz was his name. He had taken up his P-47 Thunderbolt fighter, which is a single-seat fighter, except he wasn't alone. He decided he would take up a Red Cross girl for a little joyride. And those of you who are pilots know that a pilot cannot sit in a plane with a young lady on his lap and still expect to fly the plane. The only way he can do that is to put the young lady in the plane first and sit on her lap so that he can reach the controls, and that's what he did. So he took off in his P-47 Thunderbolt. He was flying around, apparently ran out of gas because the plane had just come back from a mission, I found out later. Just come back from a mission and had not been refueled. So Harold Wirtz and this young lady dived into the swamp. They were killed instantly, of course, and then they buried for all this time until we came along. And so when we got back to the village, they laid out for us all the remains, and there they were, extensive remains, including 2 pairs of shoes, pair of ladies' glasses, and then we found his dog tag, so we knew this was the right story. And the young lady was called Harriet Gowan, and she was from Minneapolis, funnily enough. And so we followed this story because it was a hometown story. And eventually, we sat down with her one evening and said, "Well, we need to take all these remains back to America. You know, these people have got to come back to America. They fought for your country, and it's time for them to come home." So we had a little discourse on this because they then said, "Well, all right, we've decided that you can have all these remains for $2,000." And we said, "Okay, we can live with that. We'll take them. We'll give you $2,000." But then they had another discourse because all the families couldn't agree that that would be the case. And so in the end, we had to leave them there. And when we got back to America, and we told the villagers this, that we would have to tell the U.S. military about this. And the U.S. military would turn up at their village one day to claim the remains of these 2 Americans. So sure enough, 6 months later, that's exactly what happened. American MIA search group from the Army turned up at the village, and they found that the villagers had all these remains. The men were all out hunting somewhere. The women were there by themselves. They were scared to death. So they handed everything over to the Army, and they didn't get paid a penny for it. But the good news is, of course, that the remains of these 2 MIAs came home, and they've since been buried. The young lady, we went to her funeral in Minneapolis. Her coffin was covered with a Red Cross flag, and her mother and father had died 2 years before, but they had left a plot between them in case their daughter ever came home, and she was buried between her mother and father. We went to the funeral in Arlington for the pilot. He was given the most grand ceremony, funeral, and sure enough, his relatives were there. So those were 2 very personal experiences and very emotional experiences, and it was, oddly enough, it was our first real experience in Papua New Guinea. Of course, not all the stories go quite as smoothly and as happily as this one. Sometime later, I was leading a mission in Papua New Guinea. We had a 9-mile walk followed by a 4,000-foot climb to the top of a mountain where this crash site reportedly was. We were being guided by the village chief from the top of that mountain. And this was going quite well, except of course it's 90 degrees of heat and 10 hours after walking after that, and you know you are exhausted. It was complicated for me by the fact that 8 months before I'd had 2 heart surgeries and was also declared a diabetic. So it really wasn't my finest hour, but we got to the bottom of the mountain, and I was in a state of collapse. It was really more than I should have taken on. So I told the rest of the guys that you better get to the top of the mountain because it's safer there, because at that point we had just found out that we were crossing some territory belonging to another village chief, and that we did not have his permission to cross his territory. And we were told it may not be safe to stay here, safer on the mountain, which belongs to our friendly tribe. So I told the others to go at the top of the mountain, but I was so exhausted, I had to lay down. Here was a little lean-to, and it was just getting dark. It was just starting to rain, so I collapsed under this lean-to. And a couple of the natives stayed with me. Michael, who's still with me, stayed with me. And I was exhausted and lay down, fell asleep. And I woke up a little while later, and because I was hungry and thirsty. And I happened to notice that one of the natives that was with us, one of our porters, we normally have 20, 25 porters carrying all our gear because we ship in all our own food and all our own water. We don't drink anything locally. So we had, there was this one case, and I thought, oh, I wonder what's in that case. So I woke up and told Michael, can you get one of the guys to bring over that case? I want to see what's in there. Well, I opened up the case, and would you believe, it was one of only 2 cases of beer that we were taking to the top of the mountain, except this one didn't make it. There were 24 cans of beer in that case, and none of them survived the night. And I've got to say that I stayed up that night talking to the natives, and we were laughing and enjoying these cans of beer. It was one of the most interesting, funny nights that I've ever had. And by the morning, I was feeling a lot better. So it's just before dawn, and I was a bit concerned that we ought to get out of here as quickly as possible. So I woke them up before dawn and said, look, I think we better break camping and start climbing this mountain. And sure enough, that's what we did. Halfway up the mountain, everything's going fine. Later on, I found out that no sooner had we got clear of our camp, and about dawn, maybe 10, 20 minutes later, a war tribe turned up from the tribe that owned the territory and didn't like us crossing the territory, and they turned up to have a go at us. And we had just escaped that. So this tribe was really angry that we had got away, and so the first thing they did was they cut the bark from a tree at the bottom of this path that was going up the mountain, and they took there's the white of the tree now, and incidentally they all speak English in Papua New Guinea, so there's no problem communicating even with the natives. And one of the natives got the charcoal from our fire, and he wrote on the white of the tree, he said, cross here again and you die. And they waited for us, and it was the only way down the mountain that we knew of. So anyway, by this time I'm at the top of the mountain, and of course the others had got there the evening before, and that morning they had gone out and found the bomber we were looking for. So the mission had already been achieved. And but the problem became then, how do we get off this mountain? Because there were some unfriendlies down the road, and they certainly were not wishing us well. So to cut a long story short, we decided that we had a satellite camera, a satellite telephone, which you can phone anywhere in the world, and we decided that we've got to get some telephone numbers of a helicopter rescue service. But you know what? When you're in the jungle, the one thing you cannot find are the yellow pages. Now it's easier to find gold than yellow pages. So we had to get yellow pages. So one of the guys phoned his wife in Minnesota, and he woke her up. It must have been 2 o'clock in the morning. And he said, oh, good morning, dear. We got a little problem at the top of the mountain, can't get off, need a helicopter, don't have any telephone numbers. Could you phone Papua New Guinea Directory Inquiries and ask for the name of any ask for the name and telephone numbers of any helicopter services within range of a mountain called Nambamati, which is on the north coast of Papua New Guinea. I'll call you back in an hour. So, sure enough, he calls her back in there, and this wonderful lady, she'd called Papua New Guinea, and she had 2 telephone numbers for us. So we then started to call these 2 telephone helicopter services. The first one said, oh yeah, we got a helicopter, but don't have a pilot for 5 days, which of course does restrict its use somewhat. So then we phoned the second one. They said, oh, you got a helicopter? Oh yeah, we got a helicopter. Well, have you got a pilot? Oh yeah, we got a pilot. Oh, great, says we. He said, well, you've got a little bit of a problem because it's down for maintenance right now and it's not serviceable. Oh my God, when is it going to be serviceable? Well, it may be tomorrow, but we're not sure. So now we started a long wait, and the days are trickling by, and we're running out of food, we're running out of water, and running out of patience. And we're getting more and more concerned because the only way down and out was down that path, and nobody wanted to tackle that in a hurry. So anyway, eventually the helicopter boys said, well, I think we can pick her up today. So we got to the top of the mountain to a clearing where the chopper could land, and one of the most beautiful sounds in the world was that chop, 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 chop from the blades. And this thing came in about 4:30 in the afternoon. It gets dark about 6:30. So I knew we were in trouble if it didn't come through that day, and I was working on alternate plans, none of which were very good. But this chopper landed, and I got 5 of the guys in the chopper to go down to the safety of the main road, which is 10 miles away. And then the chopper came back, picked up the rest of us. You know, one of the lessons that taught us is that never go into the jungle without telephone contact with helicopter rescue services. And now it's a part of our normal practice that the mission leaders, even before the mission starts, have to make contact with the nearest helicopter service, go and see them, exchange telephone numbers, make sure your satellite phone is working, and that if we ever run into that kind of problem again, we can call up this service and they will send a chopper and pick us up in that kind of emergency. And that's now a standard practice, but you have to learn some of these things the hard way. So anyway, we came back from that, and we think back on it now as one of our more difficult problems. But the Papua New Guinea thing gets bigger and bigger as we go along. We were in New Guinea last year in '08. I had a group of 8 of us, and we were going along the north coast in boats and calling in at villages. You call in at a village, you know, and suddenly you're surrounded by 30 warriors in war paint, and they're chanting and they're waving spears and drums. And the problem is, you're never quite sure whether they're to greet you or to eat you. The only sure thing is that you find out pretty quickly soon thereafter. And in this particular case, they were there to greet us. And because they were all painted, they painted our faces as well, the same red paint. In fact, we got some video of that we're going to show you. And so they marched us into this village, and they had prepared an altar, and they had a cross over the altar, which was engraved of a US Army or something. And on the altar was a tray covered in banana leaves. We weren't quite sure what it was all about. And when we looked at it, we were still unsure. When the native chief walked up to me, he took the banana leaves off, and on this tray were 21 dog tags of what we believe were, of Americans that we believe were MIAs, and we couldn't believe it. And we looked at these dog tags in awe, and we persuaded them to sell those dog tags to us. I thought you'd like to see them. These are those dog tags, -1. -1 because when we got back to America, I went through the dog tags to look at the names. They come from all over the United States. I was interested to find out by chance if one of them was from Minnesota. And one of them was from Minnesota. And the name of on the dog tag was Alva Clark, and he comes from Brainerd in northern Minnesota. So I decided I'd call Brainerd and see if I could, by chance, contact relatives of Alva Clark. So I get on the phone and I speak to a telephone operator, put me through to Brainerd. When I get through to Brainerd, I said, look, can you put me through to any Clark family in Brainerd? And she stops for a minute and she said, well, there aren't any Clarks in Brainerd. I said, well, come on, it's a very simple name, obvious name, and this is quite a large town. There must be Clarks in Brainerd. No. She said, no Clarks in Brainerd. Puts the phone down. Well, a long time ago I learned in this business of hunting for MIAs never to take no for an answer. So I got on the phone to a radio contact of mine, and I spoke to him and said, look, I'm trying to find someone called Alva Clark, and I'm being told there are no Clarks in Brainerd. He said, nonsense. He said, I know a couple of Clarks in Brainerd. And so I said, okay, can you contact them and see if any of them know anything about an Alva Clark who was in Papua New Guinea in 1944. So he said, I'll call you back. So an hour later he called back and he said, I spoke to the 2 guys that I mentioned, and I told them you were looking for relatives of this fellow called Alva Clark, and did any of them know anything about him? And one of them said, Alva Clark was my dad. The next day I sent him his father's dog tag. So that's the way some of the things happen, and you're never quite sure what's going to happen next. All I can tell you is this: the MI hunting thing becomes very emotional at times. And as we found more and more MIAs, I became intrigued with the idea of, well, there must be a way of finding more than one airplane at a time and one flight crew at a time. I mean, that's fine, but there's an awful lot of people still missing. And when you check the records, there were still 650 airplanes and their crews missing in Papua New Guinea, Rabaul, and I think in Borneo combined. 650 still missing. And we're finding one at a time. We've got to do better than that. So we mounted a mission a couple of years ago, and I put two scouts to work, and I gave them 3 months to find more than one airplane, telling them, look, I got to bring all these people out from the United States. You must be able to find more than one airplane. And in the week we're there, we could go and find 2 or 3 or 4 if you get to work and find them. I'll put you on the payroll and pay you to find them. Be on the payroll for 3 months, and at the end of that, I want you to call me and tell me what you've done. Well, Chief Scout Michael was still with me. He phoned me up in 3 months and said, well, you better sit down. I said, what's the problem? I said, are you goofing off again? What's the problem? He said, no. He said, I've got to tell you, we didn't find 1 or 2 crash sites. I said, what? What have you been doing? He said, well, no, we found 10. And I said, you've got to be joking. No, he said, we found 10. Well, as the time went by between that, having given me that news and the time went on the mission, that 10 grew to 12. And so we took on that occasion 21 people out there, 3 missions, and each mission had 4 sites to find. And we found 11 of those 12 sites. And just to give you some idea, here's a poster. And these pictures show 21 aircraft, 21 crash sites, which we found over a period of 3 years. 21. Now, the numbers of crewmen, and some of these, there's a B-24 bomber with 11 men, and some of them are fighter planes of 1. But an awful lot of MIAs we were able to retrieve as a result of that. So armed with that, thinking, well, if we can do that, if we can find that in 3 months, now let's look ahead and plan a mission that is like no other mission that's ever been thought of or considered. And so we sat down with 3 scouts and said, look, 2 of you found 10 sites for us in 3 months. What if I told you, this is last year in 2008, a year ago, 2008. What if I said to you in 2009, we're not going to do a mission at all because I'm going to buy you a whole year to find as many crash sites as you can, and then in 2010, we're going to launch the biggest search for MIAs that's ever been conceived. So then I said to them, okay, you 2 scouts, how many crash sites, new crash sites have never been seen in 65 years, how many crash sites could you find for me in 20 months, because that's the time you're going to have to find them. They looked at each other and chatted for a while, and they both turned and said, we think we can find 20 sites each. 40 crash sites? I said, impossible. And I said, are you sure you can do that? Yes, we are. I said, fine, you're on the payroll as of October 2008 and until May 2010, and in that time, I expect you two to come up with 20 crash sites each. That's a total of 40 crash sites. That is now my goal for 2010. That 2010 we will launch missions in Papua New Guinea, and we'll take 4 or 5 missions to do this, but we will find 20 crash sites. Is that a deal? Right, you're on the payroll. They're off and running. Well, it's interesting because the objective being to find 40 crash sites by May 2010 became our supreme goal. And I can just tell you that by May 2009, they had already found 40 crash sites. And we've got the photographs of them to prove it. Because we're not going to go to Papua New Guinea and say, I wonder what's over that hill over there. Well, why don't we try those trees over there? We go to crash sites knowing exactly what we're going to look for and exactly where we're going to look and pretty much what we're going to find. And so that became the objective. And as we worked into it, with 11 months still to spare, we'd come to the point where we had found already 40 crash sites. And so I told the scouts, okay, now we're going to up the target to 60 crash sites. You've got 11 months to go. You've got to find 20 more, get back in the jungle and find them. And that's the way it goes. And that is going to launch in 2010 the biggest search for MIAs that's ever been considered. Then in 2010, we'll tell you all about it. I hope you've been intrigued by what I've told you, and enjoyed the presentation. And I'll be back to you, I hope, in 2010 to give you the best news in the world. Goodbye for now. Bryan Moon, signing off.